For decades, we've pretty much had one way of looking at autism. But what if we've been looking through the wrong end of the telescope this whole time? We're about to dive into a theory that completely flips our understanding of autism on its head. It's a story not about what's missing, but about what's overwhelmingly there.
And really, it all boils down to this one powerful question. Is the autistic brain processing too little of the world, or is it actually processing far, far too much? So, for the longest time, the go-to explanation was what we called the deficit model. The basic idea is that parts of the brain are impaired or just not active enough. But the intense world model comes along and suggests the complete opposite. It says the issue isn't underactivity at all, it's overactivity. We're talking hyperfunctional supercharged neural circuits. And look, this isn't just some philosophical idea. The intense world theory is built from the ground up on hard neurobiology. It actually grew out of some really deep, multi-level research in an animal model, which let scientists connect the dots all the way from the tiniest molecules up to observable behavior. And what they found was, honestly, it was a bombshell. The brain's most fundamental processing units, these little local neural circuits that do all the heavy lifting, they weren't impaired. They weren't underperforming at all. In fact, they were consistently in overdrive. They were hyperfunctional.
Okay, so what does hyperfunctional actually look like? Well, get this. When the researchers stimulated these neural networks, the response was just off the charts. The data shows that the neurons in the model fired back nearly twice as strongly as the controls, and that's in response to the very same input. Just imagine if everything in your world was turned up to 200%.
And this intensity isn't caused by just one thing. It's like a trifecta of hyperfunctionality. First, you've got hyperreactivity. The circuits are on a hair trigger. Second, there's hyperconnectivity with something like 50% more local connections between neurons. And third, you have hyperplasticity, which means the brain is actually too good at learning, forging memories so strongly and so vividly that it just becomes overwhelming.
So you put all of that together, and you get to the absolute heart of the theory. The intense world model proposes that autism is the direct result of these supercharged circuits, which create a sensory and emotional experience that is just, well, overwhelming. For an autistic person, the world isn't muted, it's deafening.
Right, so you have this hyperfunctional hardware. How does that actually translate into the day-to-day lived experience? The theory suggests it creates 4 major cognitive consequences: hyperperception, hyperattention, hypermemory, and hyperemotionality. Now, those are pretty clinical-sounding terms, the 4 hypers. But they raise a really, really human question. What does it actually feel like to live in a world that is defined by that level of intensity? Well, let's start with hyperperception. Just imagine everyday sensory inputs, the hum of the lights, the touch of your clothes, background noise, becoming physically unbearable. Then you add hyperattention. Your brain gets locked on to the tiniest details, like a super zoom lens that you can't turn off, making it almost impossible to shift your focus. The world just becomes a collection of intensely perceived, inescapable fragments. And on top of all that, you have hypermemory, where every one of those sharp, fragmented experiences gets burned into your mind with frightening clarity. And finally, hyperemotionality. The amygdala, your brain's fear and emotion center, is also hyperreactive, amplifying fear, anxiety, and stress. This is what can make an intense world a genuinely scary and aversive one. So how does a person cope with that constant barrage? As the original researchers put it, the individual becomes trapped in a limited but highly secure internal world. It's a logical retreat, an escape from a reality that is simply too much to bear. And here's where the theory becomes truly transformative, because it doesn't just describe a different biology, it forces us to completely reevaluate the behaviors we've always associated with autism. Let's take social withdrawal. The old deficit view would see a lack of interest, but the intense worldview reframes it as a necessary escape from overload. Averted eye gaze, that isn't an inability to connect, it's a way of avoiding an emotionally overwhelming stimulus. And those repetitive routines, they aren't a sign of inflexibility, but a vital strategy for creating predictability in a chaotic, surprising world. So in this light, behaviors that have been labeled impairments or deficits for so long suddenly make perfect sense. They can be understood as highly logical, even necessary coping mechanisms for navigating a painfully intense reality. And this theory is powerfully echoed in the personal accounts of autistic individuals. The well-known author and advocate Temple Grandin has described her own experiences with sensory overload in exactly these terms, as something truly unbearable. So, if the root cause is intensity and not a deficit, then our entire approach to support and treatment has to change, and the implications here are absolutely profound. Instead of therapies aimed at increasing exposure and forcing interaction, this theory suggests the opposite. The focus shifts to things like filtering sensory extremes, creating predictable and calm environments, and even exploring pharmacology that could help gently reduce the brain's hyperreactivity. The entire paradigm shifts. The goal is no longer about fixing a deficit in a person. It becomes about helping that person manage an overwhelming intensity in their environment. So, in the end, what the intense world theory really presents is a compelling new narrative. It suggests the autistic brain isn't broken or deficient, but profoundly different. A brain that processes the world not too little, but far, far too much. Ultimately, what this theory asks of all of us is a simple but powerful shift. To move from a place of judgment about confusing behaviors to a place of empathy for an overwhelming experience. And it leaves us with a final, vital question to consider. If the world around you felt this painfully, overwhelmingly intense, how would you cope?